We are away.
Okay. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Chris Christensen of Northern Kentucky University. Professor Christensen is a major historian of cryptography and a frequent contributor to Cryptologia. Chris, I don't know if you are in fact an editor, but you might as well be for the frequency of your contributions. And he's studied extensively the history of Allied code breaking in the Pacific, breaking in particular the Japanese codes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And without further ado, please, Professor Christensen.
Thanks, Dave. I don't have screen sharing available.
Now, I checked that and I didn't see, I thought you had it already. And spotlight. Well, I thought for sure that was done. So I apologize. Where is it? It says one participant can share at a time. I'm going to say multiple participants can share. Let's see if that made a difference. Try it again.
Seems to have worked.
All right, very good.
All right, thank you.
Yes, we can see it now. Great, thank you.
Everything looks okay?
Yep, looks good.
All right. Okay, well, thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about JN25. It's been a Japanese naval cipher that I've been exploring for maybe 12 years. And certainly feel free to interrupt and ask questions if you have them. JN25 was the primary Japanese naval cipher during World War II. It was introduced on the 1st of June, 1939. JN25 was in ciphered code, so maybe it makes sense to take a few minutes to talk about the differences between codes and ciphers. And then we can talk just a bit about enciphered code. So a code is a linguistic construction. Typically, codes replace words and phrases, usually with a short string of letters or numbers. In the early days of telegraphy, codes were often used to shorten the lengths of messages and therefore reduce the cost of sending them. But codes require some planning. They require code books. And typically these are large dictionary-like books. And they should contain all the possible words and phrases that are expected to be used in communications, and the code words or the code numbers that substitute for them. So a disadvantage of code is the effort required to prepare the code book and to distribute it. And in particular, when codes are used for secret communications, it's also necessary to frequently change the code books before the enemy has a chance to discover the meanings of the code groups. So codes can be one-part or two-part codes. Actually, JN25 started out as a one-part code and immediately evolved into a two-part. The one-part codes have the words and phrases listed in alphabetical order. And then the code words or code numbers are listed in either alphabetical or numerical order. So the one list can be used both for encoding a message and for decoding a message. But there's a weakness there. For example, if the code breaker has discovered that the string 002 is a substitute for the word about, and 008 is a substitute for the word at, then when the code breaker intercepts 006, he or she knows that it's a substitute for a word that's alphabetically somewhere between about or at. Two-part codes avoid that weakness. What they do is they substitute, the substitutions, the code groups are in a random order. The code words or code numbers are just randomly arranged. But if we do that, that requires that there be two lists in the code book. One to encode the words and phrases, and that's typically in alphabetical order, and then one to decode it in either alphabetic or numerical order, depending on the code groups. A cipher, on the other hand, that transforms a plain text message by using some sort of algorithm. And typically that produces a random string of letters or numbers and operates independently of grammatical construction. Maybe the most famous for us is the World War II German Enigma machine. It was a cipher machine. So the algorithm was implemented by means of a current that passed through a plug board and then a series of rotors and lit a lamp on a lamp panel to describe the substitution. So I mentioned enciphered code. The older terminology is super enciphered code, but that seems a bit too dramatic. The first step in enciphered code is to do the encoding. Typically, the words and phrases are replaced by the plain text code groups. So in this example, I've replaced the words and phrases by 5-digit strings of numbers. The second step is to do the enciphering. Now, historically, with enciphered codes, there have been two common methods. One is by transposition, rearranging the letters, and another is by additives. So transposition just takes the substitutions and it rearranges the order of the letters or numbers that appear. So here I've taken the 15 digits that appear from these 3 5-digit code groups and I've rearranged them. And this is my scheme for rearranging. It's a common one. I wrote the 5-digit code groups in as columns or in rows, and then I pulled out the digits by column in a particular order. So 314 was the third column, 237 was the first column, 941 the fourth, 419 the second, 632 the fifth. Now, of course, when I do something like that, I have to let the receiver know how it's done so that the receiver can undo the transposition at the end to be able to recover the code groups. Another method, and the one used by JN25, is to use additives. So a string of random numbers. So in this case, we see the plain text message on top, and then the 3 5-digit code groups that substitute for it. In yellow, those are just strings of random numbers. And then those are combined with the code group to, well, I should say they're combined by false addition. And by false addition, what we mean by that is I'm adding by digits, and we'll do this a little bit later, but without carrying. And merging these two together, I get the orange numbers that are on the bottom. And those are the guys that are transmitted.
The middle row is random though?
The middle of the row is random. So what that means, of course, is that the receiver has to have also a list of the same random numbers.
Yeah, okay.
So somehow both the sender and receiver have to have a list of random numbers that they can use for this, use for this enciphering. And that's one of the problems with using additive ciphers. So the receiver would have to have the list. The receiver would receive those orange numbers. Receiver would have a copy of the random numbers, the yellow ones, would subtract them and recover the clear code groups, the white ones, look them up in the code book, and substitute in the words or phrases that they have substituted for. So in either case, the receiver has to know either how the transposition was done or has to share from the sender the string of random numbers. Those are the two common ways to encipher code. Now, the primary way to transmit radio messages during World War II was by telegraph or radio telegraph. And the questions often asked is how do you transmit Japanese by telegraph? So maybe take a few moments just to look at the Japanese languages. So maybe the most familiar one is kanji. These are the Chinese characters. Kanji characters represent words or phrases. And this is the most precise way to communicate. Then there are two others, hiragana and katakana, that are used as both grammatical endings and also to express kanji in foreign words phonetically. So each of these alphabets can express sounds. The problem with the hiragana and katakana is that it's not unusual that several kanji characters have the same sound and therefore expressed exactly the same way in kana. Therefore, the receiver has to determine which kanji character it is by means of context. And that can be difficult.
I mean,
Another
that's how you'd have to do it in spoken language, though, right?
Yes, that's how you have to do it in spoken language also. But it seems to be a difficult process. People who are experts in Japanese tell me that it is not trivial to do this. You can be in a situation where someone gave me an example of 12 different kanji that sounded exactly the same, and gave me an example in which several of them could have appeared in the context.
So even for a native speaker, you're saying?
Yes, even for a native speaker.
Okay. Someone has been polite enough to raise their hand. Aaron, you wanted
Yeah,
to?
no, thank you so much, Professor. I have a question. Given that that was a conflict that they knew they had, is there a reason that they didn't just add sort of encoding, additional encoders, just when it came to those conflictual words or statements? I mean, just to, to sort of have a workaround or a hack, or is that just something they just wouldn't have considered?
I don't think they would have considered it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
And there was another one, and this is Romaji, which is also phonetic, just like hiragana and katakana are phonetic. It represents the sounds that we hear in kana, but in terms of Roman letters. And on this slide, all the representations that you see on the left-hand side are the same. They're all Tokyo. Now, the Imperial Japanese Navy used two of these systems. They used katakana and they used Romaji. The naval attachés used Romaji because often they had to send messages by commercial telegraph, and that required them to use Roman letters. The ships and shore stations, on the other hand, typically used kana. So often in the in World War II ciphers and codes, or well, in the ciphers, we see two different forms of ciphers, kana or Romaji, depending on whether messages were sent by commercial telegraph or a military or naval telegraph. The Romaji could be transmitted, of course, by Morse code. The Japanese had a special kana Morse to transmit the kana characters. Now, there's some ancestors to JN25, and it has an interesting history. It goes back to the Imperial Japanese Secret Operations Code of 1918. It turns out in 1921-1922, the Office of Naval Intelligence and the FBI made surreptitious entry into the Japanese consulate in New York City. And over a period of time, they photographed the entire code book. Then the Office of Naval Intelligence came to an agreement with Naval Communications to try to exploit the code. And it was the need to exploit that code that was a significant factor in the Navy establishing a research desk on the 5th of January, 1924. And Lieutenant Lawrence Safford was named to that desk. That was the beginning of naval code breaking, really. Safford hired Agnes Driscoll to be a code breaker. Driscoll had served in the Navy beginning in 1918 as a chief yeoman and had eventually been assigned to the Navy's Code and Signal section. After World War I, she stayed with the Navy as a civilian until 1923. She left to work for a year in the Hebron cipher machine factory and then was hired back by the Navy in 1924. Driscoll is a legend in Navy code breaking. She was called Miss Aggie or Madam X. She led many of the early Navy code breaking efforts, and she also was the instructor for many early Navy code breakers. Now, the Navy called this 1918 code the Red Book Code. And the name came simply because the photocopies of the book were stored in a Buckram McBee binder. The code book was translated by a Dr. B.C. Hayworth and typed by his wife. The Hayworths had served as missionaries in Japan. And on the slide, we see on the left-hand side, three possible substitutions, a 5-digit number, a 5-letter number, and a 3 kana string. A Japanese word in Romaji and its translation into English. Now, all the messages that the Navy received were by way of 3 kana characters. There's no evidence that the Japanese ever used the 5-digit substitutions or the 5-letter substitutions. Everything seemed to be three kana substitutions. So Driscoll and her team had the code book. So they knew all the substitutions, but Red Book code was enciphered code, and it was enciphered by transposition. So her job was to break the transposition cipher that had been applied to the 3 kana code groups. And they had done that by 1926. So from 1926 on, they were able to read Red Book code. Now, the transposition changed several times, but the code book did remain in place until the 1st of December 1930. And at that time, it was replaced by new code, new enciphered code, this one called the Blue Book code, again, simply because it was kept in a blue binder. The story that goes with it is that in September 1931, Driscoll was looking over the shoulder of Thomas Dyer, He was one of her students, code-breaking students. He was an advanced student, and he was working on the Red Book code. And he had hit a problem, and he just couldn't figure out what was happening. And she looked over his shoulder, and she took his papers and looked at him for a few minutes, and then announced that the reason that things weren't working was that he was no longer looking at a 3-kana code. He wasn't looking at Red Book anymore, but a new 4-kana code. And the attack began. In this case, though, the codebook had been changed. Substitutions had been changed. So Driscoll and her team had to not only recover the transposition cipher, but they also had to recover the clear code groups and their meanings. This is a little bit of a transmission of Blue Book code. Again, it was enciphered by transposition. Code groups consisted of 4-kana characters. After the message was encoded, there was a dot placed after every 10th character. And then the message was arranged in 10 by 10 arrays. And then a transposition was applied to the 10 by 10 arrays. Blue Book remained in place until 1938. And it was replaced by a code called, by the US Navy, AD. Now, some documents refer to the Blue Book code as being replaced by a Black Book code. Robert Hanyuk, who's a cryptologic historian, former NSA person, states that there never was a Black Book code. AD was quite similar to the Blue Book code, and it didn't remain in use very long, because on the 1st of June 1939, it was replaced by JN25. Now, the code actually stayed in use. In November 1940, some changes were made to it, and its use was restricted, and it became known as the flag officer's cipher. So it was used by flag officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But the primary naval code became JN25. So 3 things are necessary to send and receive messages using JN25. So one's obviously having a codebook. And the codebook consisted of all the words and phrases that could be used in communications, and the 5-digit numbers that substituted for them. And JN25 had about 55,000 code groups. So a large book. Because JN25 was enciphered by additives, it was also necessary to have a book of additives. This is where the strings of random numbers came from. So the book of additives were tables of 5-digit numbers that were used to mask the clear code groups. And typically the book had 300 pages, or in some cases 500 or 501 pages, with 100 additives on a page in a 10 by 10 array. And there was, of course, a third thing. There had to be instructions as to how to use the cipher. So let's try to encipher a message. This is a message I had up there a moment ago. It's a very brief message. Typically, messages were much longer than this. So the sender wants to report sighting 10 US Navy battleships. So this is the way the phrases would be arranged in Japanese.
If I could interrupt you before you start into this example, it looks like David raised his hand there.
Oh.
David, was that intended?
He's muted.
Is there any indication of how the Japanese accumulated their pseudo-random numbers?
No, there isn't. There's not. That's been sort of a puzzle.
Okay, thanks.
There were efforts made by both British code breakers and US code breakers to see if they could determine how the numbers were generated. Not successfully. During part of the war, JN25 was using additives that did have a pattern that the British had recognized. But I don't think they ever determined how that was generated. So that's been a question for the crypto history people, is how the random numbers were generated. There does not seem to be any history from Japan about how it was done.
I think this might be beyond the discussion, but can you give us a very brief summary of how they found that pattern? Because that sounds pretty impressive. If there was a pattern that reflects on how they were obtained.
I'm not sure I can remember the details of the story well enough to relate it without misleading. I mean, obviously the code breakers are looking for any sorts of patterns they might see. And yeah, I don't remember the details of the story well enough to describe it. It did happen in the Far East with the British Far East Combined Bureau, where one of the code breakers there had noticed some patterns that occurred in the additives.
Okay, I guess they had incentive to look carefully. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so let's try to decipher the message. So this is the message. It consists of the 3 phrases, and the sender is going to go to a code book and find the 5-digit numbers that substitute for each of these phrases. Then the sender has to select additives. Takes out the additive book, so these have to be distributed. Supposed to randomly turn to a page and randomly start from a location on that page. Now in this case, I've selected the first additive to be 04486, and that's in line 2, column 0. I place that under the first code group, and then successive additives under the successive code groups. So 65386 is the next in the line, 70207 is the next in the line. Now the cipher clerks were told that they should do this randomly. It turns out people are not very good generators of randomness. And it was known by US and British code breakers that typically the Japanese code clerks used the first 1/3 of the book. And typically when they opened to a page, they started somewhere near the upper left-hand corner. And what that meant was they often repeated using strings of additives, which is a bad thing to do with enciphered code. So we have the additive string underneath the code groups. Then they were combined using false addition, and that means to add without carries. So we could begin either on the left or right. I'm going to begin on the left. So 2 plus 0 is just 2. 4 plus 4 is 8. 3 plus 4 is 7. 9 plus 8 is 17, but there's no carry, so I just get the 7. 6 plus 6 is 2, again, or 12, so there's no carry. I just get the 2. They do that for the middle group, and then do it for the group on the right. What's transmitted then are the numbers in orange.
Doesn't there have to be some encoding of what page of the random book they started on for the receiver?
Yes. So the
Oh, there we go.
there we are.
You're welcome.
So actually, a little bit more information than that is also needed, but certainly the sender has to tell the receiver where the string is located in the additive book. Typically, that was done that the book was numbered in 3-digit page numbers, and the arrays were numbered with single-digit row numbers and single-digit column numbers. So typically they could transmit the location of the beginning and the ending of the additive string by transmitting a 5-digit number. So in this case, I used page 137 and began the string on row 2, column 0, and ended it on row 2, column 2. So these would be called starting point and ending point indicators, and they were in the message, transmitted along with the message. Now, they were not transmitted in the clear. So typically the instructions for use of JN25 would include with them a table of additives that would be used only for the indicators. And it's usually around 1,000 additives. The way the additives were selected was usually based on the day and time. And then those were used to mask the starting point indicator and the ending point indicator, and they were embedded in the message. So yes, it was necessary that the sender tell the receiver where the string of additives began and ended.
But so if I can ask, so you're saying, so the receiver receives the message on a date and time. That gives him the means to decode the starting point and ending point, which
Correct.
in turn gives them the means to decode the rest of the message. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that's correct. And actually to make sure that that was correct, the date and time were included in the heading of the message. So it was the transmission date and time that was important. So they were included in the heading of the message also. There were some other schemes that were used for it, but primarily it was based on date and time. And as I say, then there was a small table of additives that were used just to mask the indicators. So when a receiver got the message, he would look at the date and time. That would allow him to recover the starting point and ending point indicators. He could take the transmitted code groups, recover the strings of additives, and now he needs to subtract in order to recover the clear code groups. Now he added without carries, so he needs to borrow if necessary on his subtraction. But again, it's digit by digit. So we subtract 0 from 2, 4 from 8, 4 from 7. 8 from 7 is a problem, but I assume it's 17. I assume there was a carry. 6 from 2 is a problem. Again, I'm going to assume there was a carry, so I'm subtracting 6 from 12. Do that for the next 5-digit string and from the last 5-digit string. Now he's got the clear code groups, and he can go back and recover the words and phrases for which they substituted. That's the scheme for JN25 messages. So it requires a code book, a large code book, 55,000 entries. A smaller additive book, 300 pages or maybe around 500 pages. And some instructions for use. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Now, radio transmission was often garbled. And the Japanese built an error detection scheme into the JN25 clear code groups. Each of the clear code groups was a 5-digit number, but it was a 5-digit number that was divisible by 3. And mathematically, that's equivalent of saying that the digits add up to something divisible by 3. The British and American codebreakers referred to this as scanning. They would say that the code group scanned, or a 5-digit number scanned, if it was divisible by 3.
This is the transmitted, the number that's actually transmitted.
No, this is the underlying one. This is the code. This is the one that's actually in the code book.
Oh, okay.
So the one that's transmitted has been masked by a string of random digits. But this is the underlying one that's in the code book. So once you've removed the additives, the clear code groups that you see should all be numbers divisible by 3. If they're not, if it isn't a number divisible by 3, then an error has occurred. Now, it wasn't that the Japanese cipher clerks would actually go through and divide each of the numbers to see whether they're divisible by 3. It just meant that if the number wasn't divisible by 3, you wouldn't find it in the code book, and you know an error occurred. So these are the clear code groups that correspond to the words and phrases, things that are actually listed in the code book.
This is a rather cumbersome process. And of course, if the message is not clear, then they have to repeat it and re-encode it with the current date and time as well. So you can't even retransmit. You have to re-encode it in order to retransmit it, right?
Correct. But they were worried about error detection. And you know, the thing with error detection schemes is the way that they work is an error detection scheme creates some sort of pattern that when it's not present tells you that an error has occurred. And of course, what code breakers do is they search for patterns. People who are encoding messages are trying to make things random. But by doing this, the Japanese actually built a pattern into the code groups that could be exploited by US and British code breakers. And we'll get a chance to look at how they exploited that pattern. But they put it in for error detection, and it created a pattern in the code groups that could be exploited by the code breakers. Now, the cipher evolved throughout the war. If you look at things about JN25, you will see things written this way. The JN just stands for Japanese naval, and there were lots of Japanese naval ciphers. So there are many JN ciphers. The 25 is the number that was assigned to the enciphered code. Typically, those are just randomly assigned. The capital B corresponds to the designation for the code book. Now, this is a symbols used by US and British code breakers. So capital B corresponds to the second code book. So the first Japanese JN25 used codebook A. And then the number to the right corresponds to the additive book. It's often referred to as a cipher, but that's the list of additives. So it's added, here we're looking at JN25, and it's using codebook B and additive book 8. And as I said, these evolved throughout the war. Sometimes more than one was in use at the same time. The code books ran from A to R. They didn't use O and they didn't use Q, and apparently because they didn't want to make it look like a 0. And the cipher books ran from 1 to 77. So many more cipher books than code books. And I remember the code books were much larger. They had to generate a new code book, it created a large book, and then had to be distributed. For the Japanese, that meant all over the Southwest Pacific. Cipher books were much smaller and much easier to distribute. Now, it turns out that JN25 was quickly broken by the British.
I'll take your change in topic to interrupt you again because somebody had their hand up. I lost who it was though.
Professor, I'm just struck by the enormity of the task. 55,000 groups had to be rearranged for every code, and they had to come up with 50,000 new random numbers for every version of the additives. Was there a ministry of dice or something like that?
Well, as I say, we really don't know. It was a task that was difficult for them to carry out, particularly at the beginning of the war, and then again toward the end of the war. So, yeah, I mean,
I had appreciated the distribution was a problem. They had forces over a large fraction of the planet's surface, but just creating the codes is a
it is. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially full-time work, right?
Aaron?
Yes, thank you. I have a document from Naval History and Heritage Command that kind of goes over what we understand to be all of the radio communications and radio intelligence units they had, which was, as was just mentioned, just astronomical volume of people. So I'll put that link into the chat for those of you that are interested. It doesn't go into the, to the hardcore detail of the codes themselves, but it just sort of breaks out just, clearly maybe up to 1,000 different units. Basically every sizable command structure had its own radio communications group that was assigned to it, which, as was just mentioned, was an incredible task. I mean, a lot of friction, obviously, in their communications.
And of course, JN25 was not the only cipher in use.
Exactly. The whole Army signal side too had, I think, a whole bunch. I mean, dozens.
And one of the situations the Japanese had to face was the fact that the Army had Imperial Japanese Army had different ciphers than the Imperial Japanese Navy, and yet they had to work together. I mean, the Navy had to transport the Army, for example. So information about an Army unit being transported by the Navy could occur on several different naval ciphers, could occur in several different Army ciphers. But JN25 was the primary cipher for the Navy. No, let's try this. So remember, it came into use on the 1st of July, 1939. And the first breaks were made by a British code breaker, John Tiltman. He's a legend in British code breaking. mostly for breaking army ciphers. His success on breaking JN25 was based on his having previously broken a Japanese army cipher that had a similar structure. And this was during the 1930s, but then of course, in the late 1930s, the Japanese army was involved in war in China. So there were lots of Japanese army communications available. He had solved the Japanese army cipher when the Government Code and Cipher School, the British name for the codebreakers, which had been in London, briefly moved to Bletchley Park during the Munich crisis in September 1938. Bletchley Park had been chosen as the war station for the codebreakers, and when the Munich crisis occurred, they briefly moved to Bletchley Park as sort of a test run, and then moved back to London until war broke out. So the cipher went into use on the 1st of June 1939, and by the 7th of September 1939, Tiltman had broken it. He was able to transmit to Captain Arthur Shaw at the Far East Combined Bureau, the British codebreakers in the Far East, complete description of the cipher. Now, of course, knowing how the cipher is structured is not the end of things. There's still a lot to do. They had to recover the additives, they had to recover the clear code groups, they had to figure out the meanings for the clear code groups. But at that point, the breaking of JN25 was passed from Britain to the Far East Combined Bureau, the British codebreakers in the Far East, because they were close to Japan and they would be able to intercept the messages. Now, on the US side, US Navy had an intercept station called Station Cast in Cavite in the Philippines. And they had a cryptanalytic unit. There was also one in Honolulu, but neither of them had the people nor the machinery to undertake a JN25 attack. So the US Navy's attack was done primarily in Washington. And the US Navy assigned the attack on JN25 to Agnes Driscoll and to her colleagues, the people who had been working on the Red Book and Blue Book codes. A war diary that's dated in March of 1940 mentions that the first US Navy attack into JN25 was made by Driscoll, but it doesn't mention what she discovered at that point. This is not quite a year after its introduction. The same war book in September 1940, and this is about a year after Tiltman's success, mentions that she had spotted the patterns in the JN25 code groups, and in a single day, sort of everything came together, and they were able to break JN25. And that's sort of the way they describe it in their history, that in a single day, everything came together. So that was about a year after the British had broken it.
So the British did not share with the Americans that they had broken it?
No. Now remember, this is in the 1930s, right? So
Oh, okay.
neither side is at war yet.
Allies, yeah.
And also the US, sorry to interrupt, the US policy was to not have any direct engagement, with what became allies later, because we didn't want to get trapped in another war, right? We had a very strong anti. I mean, probably like nothing we've ever had when it came to how strong the anti-war movement was in the late 30s in the US.
Or at least we didn't want to be seen doing it.
Fair, absolutely.
Yeah.
David?
I think there were also security concerns. The British didn't think we were terribly secure. And of course, we had concerns about defending their empire. So there was animosity on both sides. But I wanted to ask briefly, my impression was that Tiltman's insight was into how the indicators were assembled. Is that right?
I think it's fair to say yes, that he broke things by being able to understand the indicators. He was aware of the scanning of the underlying code, that the underlying code groups had been divisible by 3. That's what he had encountered in the Army cipher. But what it turned out to be was, and again, it depends a little bit when you're looking at it from the British or American point of view. The way Tiltman approached it was that the page numbers in the additive book were numbers divisible by 3. And that's what gave him his break.
Thanks.
So it's sort of a combination of the underlying code groups being scanned and the fact that that carried over into the page numbers. But it was the indicators that he broke. And then once the indicators were broken, they were able to go from there.
So I'm guessing it must have been necessary, maybe not the code book, maybe you can decipher that from messages, but they have recovered the I forget what you called it, the random number books. Was it necessary to recover a random number book in order to read a code?
Yes, but most of the time during the war, the additive books were never fully recovered, right? They're recovered in spots.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you had an additive book, you'd know some of the additives, but not all of them. And typically that allowed you to recover some more additives. I think I have an example that might show how that would work. But it would be rare for them to recover everything in the additive book or everything in the code book. So sometimes they were guessing. Yeah, let's take a look. So once they figure out the structure of the cipher, I mean, essentially, so first of all, they discovered that it was an additive cipher, and then they discovered the nature of the indicators. They still have to exploit that. They still have to recover the additives that hide the indicators. They have to recover the additives that hide the text. They have to actually get the clear code groups, and then they have to figure out their meanings. Now, the US code breakers thought that they could do that. So remember, this was in September 1940 that they had broken into JN25. Their plan was to try to recover everything by the spring of 1941. Unfortunately for them, on the 1st of December 1941, the codebook changed. So these are the early changes in the codebooks. Up to December 1940, everyone's using, JN25 is using the original codebook. The original codebook was A. The additives book has changed. We've gone through additive books 1 through 5. But then on the 1st of December 1940, codebook A is thrown out and codebook B comes into use. The Japanese didn't change the additive book at the same time. So they kept that in place. So the recovered additives were still valid, but there's a completely new code book. And there was a difference because Codebook A was essentially a one-part code, so that if you could place things, you could place new code groups between old code groups. But Codebook B was a two-part code. It was completely randomly organized. So now they're stuck. I mean, they do have the additive book, but they have to actually even go back now and recover all the clear code groups and their meanings. And I mentioned that there were 3 primary US code breaking stations. Station Negat was the one in Washington, D.C. It was in a building called Maine Navy, which is on Constitution Avenue. It's actually right about where the Vietnam War Memorial is today. These buildings were built during World War II as temporary buildings, but they were actually in place until the Nixon administration, when they were the buildings along Constitution Avenue were torn down. Washington's job was to do research. They were the people who would try to understand the various codes and ciphers and then pass on that information to the other stations. Station Hypo in Honolulu, they were given the job of attacking the flag officer cipher. So the one that had sort of split off from the JN25 track. Often people talk about that as being a waste. There were never enough messages to break it. So Station Hypo was not successful in breaking the flag officer cipher. Station Cast was in the Philippines. And because they were located so close to Japan, it was their assignment to take on JN25. So they had the structure coming from Washington, but it was their job to exploit it. Now, of course, the British had been doing it maybe a year before. The British Far East Combined Bureau had taken over the attack when they were located in Singapore. Initially, they had been in Hong Kong. They moved to Singapore during the war in China. They left there on the 7th of July, 1937, I think. Or no, the war began on the 7th of July, 1937. In January 1942, so after World War II broke out, they moved to Colombo. Should be an O in there instead of a U, which is now in Sri Lanka. And Singapore fell to the Japanese in February 1942. They didn't stay at Colombo long. They moved to Kilindini in Mombasa on the east coast of Africa, which placed them quite a ways away from being able to do good intercepts. But then in 1943, they were able to move back to Colombo. But this is where the cooperation occurred. In early February 1941, so again, this is before the war broke out. The U.S. was in the war. Britain, of course, was already in. In early February 1941, there was a 4-man team, 4 code breakers, consisting of Abraham Sinkoff and Leo Rosen, both of whom were with the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service, and Prescott Currier and Robert Weeks, both of whom were with the Navy's group OP-20G, Navy code breakers. They went to Bletchley Park to begin an exchange of cryptologic information with the British. During that visit, the US and British codebreakers exchanged information about JN25. So this is probably their first exchange. And it appears that the British had more information to exchange than the US did. But what happened was that while they were there, well, they're still at Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park ordered the Far East Combined Bureau to begin a complete exchange of materials and methods with the U.S. station in the Philippines, Station Cast. And in late February, one of the British codebreakers, Malcolm Burnett, left the Far East Combined Bureau and went to Station Cast to work with them on JN25. So it was at this point when the two began cooperating on JN25. Then, of course, on 7th of December, Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and began other attacks in the Southwest Pacific region. Just prior to the attack, again, they made a change in JN25, not an unusual thing in war, right? To do a change of cipher just before a major event is going to occur. So in this case, the codebook remained the same, but the additive book was changed. Much easier to change the additive book. However, what it meant at that point was that the US Navy had to immediately change from sort of a gradual cryptographic recovery to an operation that was fast enough to provide operational intelligence. In Hawaii, Joe Roquefort was the director of the codebreakers at Station Hypo. They were immediately switched from the flag officer cipher to attacking JN25. I should point out that Joe Roquefort was from Dayton. He was born in Dayton. In the Far East, Station Cast, the Philippines, at the time of the attack, they were at Corregidor, but they had to move. And the Far East Combined Bureau, the British group, which was located in Singapore, also had to move. So their work was sort of interrupted while those two groups moved to safer areas. The US group moved to Australia. So Station Cast, as they moved to Australia, and they combined with an Australian signals intelligence unit to form what was called FRUMEL, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne. They were able to recover enough JN25 intelligence to stalemate the Japanese attack on Port Moresby at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Now, during the battle, the Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho, and their fleet carrier Shokaku was badly damaged. U.S., on the other hand, lost carrier Lexington, and Yorktown was badly damaged. But the Japanese attack was stopped. Once again, at the end of May, the codebook changed. But this time, both the codebook and the additive book changed. It appears that the Japanese had intended to make changes earlier, but because they were being so successful in their invasions in the Southwest Pacific, they did not have time to distribute the codebooks. But at the end of May, they changed both the codebook and the additive book. Now, this, of course, was just prior to the Japanese attacks on the US bases in Midway and in the Aleutians. Unfortunately for the Japanese, by the time that they made the changes, the Navy had already obtained enough information to know the Japanese order of battle for the Battle of Midway. And Admiral Nimitz had enough information to ambush the 4 Japanese carriers that spearheaded that attack. All 4 of the Japanese carriers were sunk. U.S. Navy lost Yorktown, but maybe the primary effect was that Japanese naval aviation was crippled for the rest of the war. And one of the stories that goes along with that, war correspondent Stanley Johnston, he was aboard Lexington when it was sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea. And he was returning to the United States with some of the crew from Lexington. They became aware that Nimitz had information that had led to his being able to ambush the Japanese carriers at Midway. And upon his return to the United States, Johnston wrote a story about the Battle of Midway. It was published in the Chicago Tribune, and other papers picked up on it. There's certainly enough detail in the story to suggest that the Navy had broken JN25. And the Navy was furious. They expected the Japanese to replace or make changes in the cipher. And that would, of course, stalemate their code-breaking efforts. As it turned out, there's no evidence that that happened. But at least briefly, the Navy was very concerned that Johnston had indicated to the Japanese that JN25 had been broken. We don't hear much about British work on JN25. And that's because, except for that initial break by John Tiltman and those early contributions by the Far East Combined Bureau, British were not really involved in the attack on JN25. The primary reason is that on 2nd of October 1942, the U.S. Navy and Bletchley Park came to an agreement, the Holden Agreement. Deputy Director of Bletchley Park, Edward Travis, and Frank Birch of the Naval Section went to Washington, and they came to an agreement with U.S. Naval Communications. The person representing U.S. Naval Communications was Captain Carl Holden, therefore the Holden Agreement. What is said was that the British would withdraw from any cryptanalytic attack in the Pacific. Now, it's just sort of a practical thing, right? It permitted the British to focus their work on the war in Europe, and they passed direction and control of the code-breaking work against the Japanese to the U.S. Navy. Bletchley Park was allowed to maintain a small research and intelligence section, just so that it wouldn't lose touch of the Japanese problem. But the Holden Agreement set bounds on Bletchley Park's work on JN25 and on other Japanese naval ciphers.
Could excuse me, interrupt you again. David's got his hands up.
Okay.
That agreement struck me as pretty much only the recognition of the practicals. The British weren't getting enough JN25 signals to work with. But I'm kind of interested, there's a story about how the Germans repeatedly concluded that there was no information security problem with Enigma. You would have thought the Japanese would have at least questioned the security of JN25 or the Admiral's Code if the U.S. Navy showed up exactly at the right time to ambush them at Midway. Was there any formal response from the Japanese about that?
There seems to have been some concern, similar to what the German Navy had concerns about Enigma. But I don't think there was any. They were not convinced that that the ciphers had been broken. And of course, they always. It's a little bit different from like using Enigma, where you have a machine that can't be changed, right? I mean, you can change your code books. You can change your additive books. You can make some slight changes in how a code is used. So in some sense, it might be easier to make a change in a code to deal with something like that. You know, if you think that someone has broken your code, you can put out a new code book, or you can slightly change the procedure for using it. There
Oh,
are
I see. So
there are
the change
times,
in code book was thought sufficient.
right? I mean, there are times that we see during the war where Japanese were worried about an additive book being compromised, so that they had sent out additive books and they might have been compromised. They would do things like put out instructions that to use the previous additive book, but write the digits backwards. Or instead of going across rows, go down columns, or things of that nature. So maybe in some sense, it's easier to deal with that when you're dealing with the code.
Okay, thanks.
But there's certainly times when they did make emergency changes. And there were typically emergency ciphers in place that they could switch to. I mean, there were similar they're just different JN25 versions, but there were times when they would say switch to the emergency version. So I think probably feel more comfortable about making changes like that than, you know, the problem with a cipher machine is you're stuck with the machine. So in September 43, Italy withdrew from the war. And the Italian section at Bletchley Park found themselves out of work. Now, it turned out the Italian Navy had also been using additive ciphers. So the Italian codebreakers at Bletchley Park, they were familiar with additive ciphers. They were out of work, and they moved them over to the JN25 section to reinforce it. And after a couple months of becoming familiar with JN25, they began working out their relationship with the US Navy again. The JN25 party at Bletchley Park was directed by Edward Simpson, and he was one of those who had moved from the Italian Navy section. And I was fortunate that over a period of 3 years, Edward and I we never met personally, but or person to person, but over email, I would describe to him what I knew about the U.S. Navy's attack on JN25, and he would describe to me how Bletchley Park had attacked JN25. So I appreciated his sort of tutoring me on JN25 and how the British attacked it. I think there's time to do just a little bit of code breaking. So let's try. When we deal with enciphered code, probably the most important concept is the idea of depth. And depth occurs when additive strings from different messages overlap. So here I've got parts of two additive pages, and I don't have the 5-digit numbers in place. I just have the rows and column numbers in place. But I'm assuming a message was enciphered using the additive page on the left, and that the additives began on page 304, row 4, column 3, and extended through row 6, column 5. And then someone else sent another message. They happened to pick the same page, 304, and they started their additives on line 5, column 2, and ran them to line 7, column 1. The green there is where they overlap. That's when the two messages are in depth. The corresponding code groups in each message were then enciphered with the same additives. And when we've got two code groups that have been ciphered by the same additive, some relationship between those clear code groups remains. So for example, if I've got two code groups enciphered by the same additive, they're both in depth. A situation like this, if I subtract one from the other, I strip off the additive. Now, I don't get either clear code group, but I get their difference. And that is something in the clear still, and it's something we can work with. So for example, on the left-hand side, I've got two enciphered code groups. So they're orange, they were transmitted. On the right-hand side, I've shown how they were created. The one on top, it's clear code group. The one from the code book was 28434, and then that additive in yellow. The other one was created with the code group 14286 coming from the code book in the same additive. If I subtract, then of course, as I pointed out, the additive is stripped off. And whether I'm looking at the enciphered groups and subtracting, the ones in orange, or the clear code groups and subtracting, the ones in white, I get the same difference. That's what we can recover from depth. So there's the idea of a difference table. Usually when there are enough code groups recovered, and that's maybe around 100 code groups, code breakers would begin to construct difference tables. So let's assume we've got 100 code groups, fairly frequent ones. So I'm going to take 100 of the most frequent code groups. I'm going to construct a difference table by doing this. I'm going to take each code group and I'm going to subtract it from each of the other 99 and record the difference and the groups that produced it. So, example. So, this is the clear code group 89172. Is the clear code group for the Roman letter E. It's a fairly frequently used code group. 94275 is also a frequent code group. And it's an instruction that the cipher clerk should use an auxiliary table for the next two code groups. When I subtract them, I get the difference 15103. So what the difference table would consist of is this difference 15103 and the two code groups that produced it, 94275, 89172. And we do that for all of the 100 most frequent code groups. Having a difference table allows us to do code breaking. So here's a worksheet. It comes from a US Navy document. It's got 6 messages. The messages are between the parallel lines. We're looking at 4 code groups in each message, and they are in depth. So we know that each column has been enciphered by the same additive. And in fact, columns 1, 3, and 4, the additive's already been determined. That's the number at the top. I don't know the additives for column 2, and I want to attack those. But they are in depth. So here's column 2. What I want to do is I want to subtract the first group from all of the others. So here are the groups, and I'm going to subtract the first group from all of the others. Remember, that's going to remove the additives, and now I'm getting the differences of clear code groups. And I check in the difference table to see whether any of these appear. As it turns out, none of them do. So I go back to the column. This time I'm going to subtract group 2 from all of them. I get these differences. I'm going to go to the difference table to see whether any of these appear. Well, that's one we've seen. We've just created that difference. What do we know about it? I know that that difference resulted from subtracting these 2 clear code groups. So does that help me? On the left are the 2 groups in depth. When I subtract them, I get the 15103. On the right are the 2 clear code groups. I subtract them, I get 15103. Is there a common additive? Is there something that works for both of those that I can add to the guys on the right to get the guys on the left? Can I find something that goes in there? And by subtraction, I find out that 95689 works. There's the potential additive. I'm going to try that on the column. So I'm going to take the second column, subtract that from each number in the column. If that's the correct additive, then these are all clear code groups. How do I know? Well, remember the Japanese built in an error detection scheme. Do these guys scan? Is each one of these a number divisible by 3? Well, I try them. One at a time, divide by 3. That one's not. But I've got 5 numbers that are divisible by 3. And the chances of getting 5 numbers divisible by 3 at random is pretty small. So I'm going to say that the 5 numbers here that scan are valid code groups, and the one that doesn't is a garble. And then try them. Well, it turns out in this case that the code breakers actually knew the meanings of those code groups. The 5 code groups that we thought were valid are shown on the right, and those meanings all fit into the message and make sense. I've got one garble. But I've now recovered another additive. So in the string of additives on the page that these came from, these numbers up top, I'm able to fill in a gap of the additives. If I had not known one of the meanings of these clear code groups, I might be able to have figured it out in context and then also recovered a meaning. That's the scheme that's used. Does that make sense?
No, but I get that they're using differences to figure it out, and I am remarking to myself, this is all pre-computer, or pretty much. This is a lot
Yes.
of handwork.
Well,
Well, they did have computers. They were called human computers.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yes.
But they also had machines.
Yep.
This is called a depth analyzer.
Okay.
It's got 12 rows of 5 numbers each. And what you can do is it's set up to analyze columns such as this. On each of these, you can turn a dial to set a digit and set each row to be a one of those columns in depth, like we saw one of the column of recovered code groups. And down at the bottom are some wheels that allow you to do subtraction. Now it's a little hard to see the numbers here, but the numbers on the machine are color-coded: red, gold, and green. When you do a subtraction, what happens is that instead of having to divide and see whether these numbers are divisible by 3, they just memorize the color patterns. So as they were testing additives, they could do it on the machine by hand, and then look at the color patterns that appeared to determine whether they all scanned or not.
So what does a valid pattern look like?
So the valid patterns are these guys. Let's see. Yeah, all of these. All of these would be valid patterns, I believe. Anyway, what they would do is remember the colors rather than have to do the arithmetic. And that model, that idea sort of morphed into a more sophisticated machine, which was electromechanical rather than having to do it by hand. And this has room for 20 code groups, also colored. And this was built at the Naval Computing Machine Laboratory, which at that time was located at National Cash Register in Dayton. And then these were used to do the arithmetic to add and subtract code groups and determine whether they scanned. Now we sent some of these to the British. They referred to them as fruit. The reason being that they thought they looked like slot machines. And fruit is a British slang term for a slot machine. Now, on the other hand, there are 2 comments about the machine. One is it kept breaking down, so maybe not used so much. And also that people who were doing this process regularly could probably beat the machine doing it by hand. So for the most part, machines were produced. I'm not sure how much they were used. But I should then add here that the Naval Computing Machine Laboratory was located, as I said, at National Cash Register in World War II. They built lots of code-breaking machines for the Navy. Probably their most famous is the U.S. Navy cryptologic bomb that broke the four-wheel Enigma. The lab up there was directed by Joe Desch, electrical engineer with NCR. Now, his daughter, Debbie Anderson, still lives in Dayton, and she maintains a website about the Naval Computing Machine Laboratory. It's got a lot of information about the work that was done there during the war. A number of waves were stationed there to help build the machines and learn to operate them. The interesting follow-up was that toward the end of the war, the Navy decided that they had been producing a new machine for every problem that occurred. And they decided that what they really wanted was a universal machine. So obviously, I mean, now we would think of as a computer. At the end of the war, they asked NCR whether they wanted to continue operating the Naval Computing Machine Laboratory there and build computers for the Navy. And NCR decided that they would rather go back to building cash registers. So they bailed out on the opportunity to continue the building naval computers.
Great call.
Yes, the operation was renamed Engineering Research Associates and moved to Minneapolis. It had an exclusive contract with the Navy, which bothered the Congress because many of the employees were former naval personnel. So they reformed as Remington Rand. And their first computer that they built for the Navy, Atlas, became the UNIVAC 1101 in commercial use. They also morphed into Sperry Rand, and one of their spin-offs was Cray Computers.
What's mind-boggling is that one call by NCR would have transformed the whole Ohio Valley area. I mean, like into basically Silicon Valley. I mean, it's incredible when you think about that.
Well, and strangely, to mention Silicon Valley, Dayton, prior to the war, is often referred to as the Silicon Valley of the U.S. It was a town full of inventors.
Yeah, going back to the 1890s and early 1900s even, I think.
Right. I mean, you know, the Wright brothers were up there. Dayton Electric was Delco, NCR, and all the engineers up there. The Engineers Club in downtown Dayton, where all these people got together to talk about their inventions, and it seemed like it was just an area full of people who were inventive. But then after the war, things have changed some.
Of course, the one upside is none of you would be here on this call if that had happened, because the $10 trillion that would have flowed into Ohio Valley, you'd all be running startups or retired or venture capitalists or whatever. So.
Well, there is that. But that was a significant part of the Navy's work during the war, was the building of code-breaking machines, and that was all located up at Dayton, all at NCR. But it did lead the Navy to head in a direction of wanting to build computers. You know, during the war, we've seen computers in use to do calculations, like the calculations for the atomic bomb research and things like that. Essentially, the Navy used them for logical testing. They're testing whether or not things were possible. Like the cryptologic bomb, where you would test to see which settings were possible on the machine and which weren't, and therefore have only a small number to test against messages. So I think that's an interesting part of the naval code-breaking history that was located up here in Dayton, and they produced a lot of machines. This additive machine, the fruit machine, maybe not the best of them, but I think that's all I have for you. So I'd be glad to, again, try to answer questions or talk a little bit more. I'm going to have to leave fairly soon.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah, we do often have questions at the end. Rather than me managing hands, I'm going to suggest we just turn your mic open and have a free for all.
Hey, Professor, I remember that without subtracting from the impressiveness of what people did there, I did in breaking the codes in the Pacific. From that book by Donovan and Mack, I saw the following very surprising statement. And he only references computer experiments he did on a preserved code book. But he said, if a JN25 system scans, has a weak indicator system, I guess, so it can be put in depth, and has frequencies of occurrence of its common code books comparable with those of JN25L. If you have 1,000 GATs in a depth of about 13, that's enough to reveal about 90% of the GATs, 90% of the code groups. Now, of course, it's terribly laborious building up the code group, but that kind of implies that a code system like that is inherently vulnerable. I mean, if you put enough time on it. Is that consistent with your effort?
Yeah, I don't know that I could verify Peter's statistics. He is good at determining those sorts of things. Most of the time during the war, the depth that they have was somewhere between 2 and 5. So I remember Edward telling me that the British were very grateful if they had a depth of 5.
But when you say depth of 5, you mean an overlap of 5?
Right. No, 5 groups that were all five groups that were all enciphered by the same additive.
Oh, okay.
So practically people were dealing with a lot less than that threshold.
Yes.
That's important to know. Thanks.
And of course, that's what you want to happen with the additives, right? What you want to make sure is that the additive strings are not reused so that depth is not created. The problem that the Japanese had was that they did tend to use the first third of the code book. And they did tend to typically start at the upper left-hand, nearer the upper left-hand corner of the page. So they repeated more. At one time, they decided that their instructions would be that they would always begin the next string of additives immediately after the previous one. That also turned out to be bad because essentially then what you're doing is you're working your way through the code book or the additive book, and the code breakers can take advantage of that also. Right? They really needed randomness, and they didn't make any attempt to enforce it. It
Yeah,
just
think
said,
that humans are not random. I used to do an experiment occasionally. I was a high school math teacher for a while, and I would split the class into 2 groups and tell one of them to write a series of random 1s and 0s on the board, and the other one I would tell them to actually flip a coin and record the results and record a sequence of 50 or 100 numbers. And when you walk back in, you can immediately tell which one was done by the coin and which one was done by people, because the one done by the coin will have a long sequence of 1s or a long sequence of 0s somewhere in it, because actual randomness, that can happen, and humans try to be more random than that, and so they don't do that. So more in the vein of what you're saying, humans are also lazy. Flip the book open here, stick the finger there, start reading.
well,
Well, I
apparently,
should add that torpedoes are hitting your ship while you're doing this.
yeah.
well, apparently the reason,
No, go
the
ahead,
reason to
Tim.
use the upper left-hand corner was so that they wouldn't have to turn the page on the
Yeah,
same
right.
message.
Yeah, right.
Well, and we have to be honest when we look at the scale of what the Japanese were attempting to sort of engineer, like as a as a parallel signals communications army. That's going to be made up of a lot of what, in the US would have as E1s and E2s, who are just high school graduates, or if they even graduated high school, they're just drafted, conscripted in. And so you're just going to get a very lowest common denominator, weakest link in the chain when it comes to, and then you start building the culture into their, they had a very strong NCO core. But it's the same thing, right? At the end of the day, if 12 people are doing the same thing and it looks good, nobody's sitting there saying, well, let's benchmark this, right? Let's just keep doing it. And it just repeats itself. I think one other thing that is really important about Midway, and once again, Professor, I really appreciate this fantastic presentation, is that the Japanese really fundamentally had a battle plan, which was called Kentai Kessen, which was the decisive battle doctrine, which is basically Alfred Thayer Mahan's approach to dominating the Pacific.
Yeah, they kept on fighting that final battle until they had nothing to fight it with.
That's exactly right. Like I think I've always, I did a whole series of presentations on the Pacific War for a group that I'm part of. When you really dig in, you just realize like they were just tripling down that bet. I mean, very, very similar to the objective to what the Soviets were doing going west, right? They were just going to go west until there was water or not a breathing German. I mean, it was really that simple. And in a certain way, the Japanese had a naval strategy that sort of mirrored that, treating sort of water as land. And they just could not reconcile basically that the Americans or anybody could be either more capable than them, or I would say sophisticated in how they applied their doctrine, because their doctrine at that point had linkage to their empire, which had linkage to their god, and it just became one symbiotic approach. So anyway, sorry to take so long to explain that, but I think that's always really important to remember about the Japanese doctrine.
Also, your comment about the cipher clerks. During 1944, the Japanese implemented a version of JN25 codebook and cipher book that was never broken. And they did that because they made it a very complicated way to encipher JN25 messages. But as it turned out, the cipher clerks refused to do it.
Yeah,
they started sending messages in other codes so that they didn't have to use JN25. And essentially, the Japanese were forced to make it simpler so that their cipher clerks would use it. And then by doing it, the moment they made it simpler, US Navy was back into JN25.
What is fascinating is how at a strategy level, and I think it's global, we always struggle with this problem of layering and complexity, right? I mean, because another approach the Japanese could have taken is they could have had a swapping calendar, which you can still have easier, or relatively speaking, easier communication code books. But if you don't know which one's going on, I mean, you're sort of, from a counter intel standpoint, you're sort of swapping your whole shop on a daily basis. And it's really like what you're doing is collapsing the OTA loop down on on whoever's trying to decipher you. And eventually you're just going to grind them down, right? Whether it might take 3 months, 6 months, people are just going to be burnt out, because they're swapping every 1 day, 3 days, 12 hours. And they wouldn't have had to move too far up the complexity curve. Maybe just add a little bit of complexity, like an encoding layer to each one, and then just be swapping between different generations, A, L, R, gen, just move around. And that probably would have been very difficult for the US. We'd have to put enormous resources on that to actually stay current with the Japanese coding system.
Well, not only that, I mean, the whole scheme depends on being able to spot patterns.
That's right.
And if you don't have enough messages in a particular system, you're not going to be able to spot the pattern. The scheme you mentioned is actually sort of put into use in one of their, in 1944, one of their changes was that the additive books had 2 lines. Each line was split into 2, and you would use the top line, I can't remember which order now, but the top line if the message started in an odd number hour, and the bottom line if it started in an even number hour. So
Brilliant.
they use different lines in the code book depending on the time of day at which the message was sent.
Professor,
Yeah, that would be impossible. I mean, in essence, impossible to sustain a team that would attempt to stay current with that.
Right.
regarding the practicality, I mean, the previous speaker has raised the interesting point about the degree of education of the code clerks. But in your view, looking back, was the error check system, the scannability of the code, an appropriate intervention by the Japanese? Were the garbles or the fumbles of code clerks really that significant?
I don't know that I have an opinion one way or another on that. Certainly, you've read Peter Donovan's material. So Peter Donovan, he's an Australian mathematician. His view is that that was the fatal flaw in JN25, the fact that the code groups scanned. Scanning was in fact dropped later in the war, and they replaced, I mean, they still had an error detection system that turned out that the scheme that they used was the clear code groups had no zeros in them. But that also allows you to exploit that. I don't know. I don't know how much difference that made for them to be able to recognize garbles. It certainly made a significant difference for U.S. and British code breakers. It was a way that we could determine the clear code groups, and as tried to show in the example, that you could actually spot when you found them. But I don't know how significant it was for the Japanese. Not all of their systems had error detection. But then, of course, this was their major system for the Navy. So,
and imagine myself on the in a code room of a ship that's rapidly sinking and being the officer standing over me and shouting the equivalent of Mach Schnell, and my reliability in following all the rules might not be wonderful.
mm-hmm. No, it's it took a long time to encipher and send, encode, encipher, and send messages. And something like Enigma is a little bit faster in that the enciphering part occurs mechanically, electromechanically.
Yeah, that was one of the great things about how the code talkers were developed, is that they, I mean, it speaks to the scaling of human beings, that they had this sort of retro they would go through every day, because we had our own communications. So at the end of the day, they would say, hey, did you see this new message or that one? There was an adjustment, et cetera. So we were like almost not real time, but pretty near real time adjusting our communications, in a way that the Japanese, it just sounded like gibberish, basically. I mean, they were able eventually to do some pretty interesting work, but it was far too late. I mean, to be able to break the the Navajo, but it wasn't just Navajo, right? So that was it was almost what we was talking about earlier. They started realizing, or we started realizing, because not everyone was Navajo, right? So they all had their own different dialects or their own different languages, Comanche, et cetera. And they started just making up like loan words, right? They just invented language that just nobody knew but the 12 of them or 20 of them or 30 of them, which was just impossible to break.
My impression
it
is
was
the Japanese viewed their language as a defense, something on the order of that, but not perhaps as effective. Not many Westerners speaking Japanese.
that's true.
Yeah, I wondered about that too. You were talking about, shoot, what was it? Something said earlier was a comparison to the code breaking in the European theater versus the Asian theater, and a thought that went through my head was you have a lot more intermixing, and there are a lot more, people in Britain that speak German, that you might gain more of an advantage in the code breaking because you have people around that really do more people around that understand the language, fluently. I'm sure there were many who did speak Japanese fluently, but I'm suspecting it was a smaller number.
Well, I mean, if the Canadians in the US didn't inter, roughly 500,000 Japanese, I think we would have had a code breaking army that would have been, I mean, it would have been absolutely transformative. And actually, to take it a step further, we probably could have had the ability to apply information in psychological warfare that just would have, I mean, it would have driven them nuts, probably.
Professor, could I ask for your insights on a couple of things? As you mentioned, it was a fairly laborious task to encipher and decipher messages by code clerks who you pointed out weren't the most educated people. That's a pretty compelling reason for going to cipher machines. And I remember the Japanese fielded cipher machines that were not terribly resistant to cryptanalysis. But why didn't they take a similar path to the Germans in getting, and putting more effort into the development of an appropriate cipher machine? Why, in your view, did that end up?
Well, certainly the machines we think about, we associate with the Japanese, red, purple, those are huge machines. Those are not portable. Those were used by diplomats, attachés, people who were in, shore-based stations, or sometimes on large ships. But unlike Enigma, they couldn't just sort of move it around with small units. They did develop a machine that was similar to Enigma, but it came into use very late in the war. So it never really got any use. The Germans developed an Enigma machine to use for communications between the Japanese and the Germans, but then of course they never really had any reason to use it other than Japanese ships going to Europe to pick up supplies and things like that from the Germans, because the two never fought together. There is a history of Japanese cipher machines, but not small ones, it seems.
The Americans and the Italians managed to use the M209, which was about as big as a cigar box, and wasn't a powered machine. So the contrast is just striking.
Yes, but that was not. Remember, that was not very secure. That gave you a short window in which the messages were secure. That wouldn't have worked for like JN25 messages. We were talking number of hours as far as the Italian and
just because you're saying they were not deeply enciphered, and so they could be broken in a shorter period of time. Is that
right,
what you?
Right. People knew how to break those. There was a way to break those messages. It just took time. And so for a tactical situation, if you needed a few hours, they work fine. If you're doing sort of a strategic situation in which you have to plan and move ships and assemble a fleet and things like that, that's over, maybe a month. The messages would certainly have been broken by then.
I've read about them that the machine, the M209, was actually secure, but was actually secure if you didn't have a large message volume.
No.
I think a lot of cipher systems fall
Sure.
into that category.
Sure. As I say, what the code breaker looks for is patterns. So you need multiple messages with the same setting.
Well, we are nearly at our 2 hours, which is not necessarily a limit, but is often about when we wind things down. And you also mentioned that you had to go soon. I don't know what time that implied, but
Noon is around
good.
that time. So
Okay. Well, unless there are any pressing last minute questions, I will thank you once again on behalf of the Association for Rational Thought Group for joining
Thank you.
us. I'm going to
Thank
go
you
ahead
very
and
much, Professor.
stop the
Thanks.
recording.